Hey, welcome back to Bob's Two-Car Garage. Now, a few weeks ago, one of my daughters came to me and asked me if it would be cheaper to buy a table from Target or if we could make one. Well, you could buy it from Target, but I thought it would be kind of cool to make one. So stick around. I'm going to show you how we made a mid-century dining room table. Stick around for the whole video. Hi, my name is Bob, and I love my two-car garage. Now, she wanted it to be mid-century, which back in the mid-century, we used to call that modern. Now, fortunately, I happen to have some old textbooks laying around, so I got my old textbooks out and started looking through them, and surprisingly, there was a lot of mid-century stuff in here. Makes sense because the book is from the mid-century. Size was really important to them. They wanted it to be extra big. We made it 42 inches wide and 84 inches long, which is really on the outside edge of what would be considered normal. So if you're making a table, I suggest that you make it just a little bit narrower, smaller, especially in the width. I cut it to width on my table saw, and I cut it to length on my little battery-powered Makita circular saw. Love that little saw. As far as material goes, I used a MDF core veneer with walnut on the outside. Now I used this because I had it. I had it left over from another job that I did. So it wouldn't be my first choice. I think a good choice if you're making a table, making a walnut table, would be to use 3/4 inch plywood, walnut veneer, or if you really want to do a super job, you can make it out of solid walnut, but that's a lot more work and a lot more expensive. I had this 1/2 inch veneer laying around, or I had it on hand, so that's what we used and made a good choice for us. Now, because I used 1/2 inch material to begin with for the top, I needed to do something to make it look thicker. So what I did is I cut some 10-inch wide strips of 1/4 inch thick MDF, and then I glued and stapled them to the bottom. And of course, I was really careful when I stapled that 1/4 inch MDF to the bottom that I didn't staple through the top. So I used 1/2 inch staples to staple that on there. And I checked my staple gun more than once to make sure that I wasn't making a mistake. So now it looks thicker. It looks like 3/4 inch. Well, I cut this top just a little bit too wide, so I need to shave off about 1/4 inch. I can't do it on my table saw because my table saw doesn't go out wide enough, which is kind of a typical problem. So I'm going to shave it off with my cool little Makita battery powered saw. I should get paid for all these advertisements. So those track saws like the Festool, and Makita makes one too, they're pretty cool, but you can do a lot with just a straight piece of wood and a little skill saw. To determine the size and shape of the legs and how they were going to be attached, I laid things out full size on a sheet of MDF. This is really good practice when you're doing a custom piece like this, a one-of-a-kind deal. Really helps you to see how it's going to go together. So I do this a lot. I did this little mock-up to make sure that my construction was going to work here, and I think it is. Got 3-inch rails for the sides, big block in the corner. Gonna have some bolts right here to hold this leg in. This leg's gonna be a little bit thicker. It's gonna be 1 inch rather than 3/4 inch. But anyhow, I wanted to do this mock-up first just to make sure that I was thinking straight, and I think I am. The table height is 29 inches, and the height of the leg, if I measure straight up from the floor, is 28 1/4. So subtract for the thickness of the top. Once I was sure about the size and shape of my legs, I started cutting up my walnut. Now I used 1/2 inch walnut and I glued it together or laminated it together to give myself a full 1 inch on the thickness of these legs. Laminating the walnut together was pretty straightforward. A couple things that were important. Number one, I wanted to make sure that a glue line did not show. So I used a dark glue, and just in case there was any little bit of a line that could possibly show. I clamped it up like crazy. I used every clamp in my garage. Before I clamped, I spread that glue out, so I made sure that I had a nice even coat of glue. So after looking at a lot of books and a lot of thought, like probably way too much thought, I decided to cut this angle right here, put this angle at 8 degrees. I think it's a good idea. So in order to better utilize my materials, I'm fitting 2 of these legs on one. I'm going to cut it down the middle first on my bandsaw, and then I'm going to cut it on the table saw. I'm going to make myself a simple jig for cutting the tapers on my legs. You can do something really fancy that adjusts and everything else, but if you're just cutting one set of legs, you don't need to get that complicated. I'm just going to use a piece of scrap wood and some poplar and throw together a little tapering jig. It's really all you need, unless you're doing a lot of legs over and over again and different types. But this one, when I'm done, I can throw it away and it's going to do a fine job. I need a little flat spot right here so that I can attach it to my rails and the top. So I'm going to lay out, come up 3 inches and draw a square line from this edge right here. Cut that on my cutoff saw, my miter box saw. Now that miter box saw is pretty accurate, but it's not perfect. So I'm going to come over here to my sander and make it perfect. Perfect. Be nice if I had a joiner, but I don't. So I'm sanding off the saw marks with some 120. Then I'm going to come back at it with some 150 for my finish sanding. There are some people out there that will tell you that sanding doesn't matter, but it matters a lot, especially when you're using a wood with a really nice grain on it. Spend some time really doing a good job on the sanding. I'm going to sand with 150 and stop, but you could even go further than that. You can go with 220, and the more you sand, the more the grain of the wood is going to pop and just show you the natural beauty of that wood. So don't cut corners on the sanding. And you know what? Sanding can be a pleasurable experience. On the front edge of these legs, I'm going to use this 3/8 radius right here and round it off on the front side. Right on the back side, I'm going to leave it pretty sharp. Probably just break it with my hand with some sandpaper. I cut some rails out of poplar, 3 inches wide, for attaching my legs to my top. I use my miter box for cutting a 45-degree angle on the end of each of those rails. I directly laid out on the bottom side of my top the exact position of every rail and every leg. Cutting these little blocks for the corner of my rail to hold on my legs. Now along the top and inside edge of each of these rails, I cut a little slot about every 16 inches or so to accommodate the hardware that I'm going to use for attaching the rails to the top. Now, this type of hardware is really important if you're using if you have a solid wood top, because that solid wood will expand and contract quite a bit, and the hardware accommodates that. However, sheet goods do not really expand and contract that much. A 3/4 inch piece of plywood across a 4-foot span will only expand and contract about a 1/20th of an inch, which isn't not a lot to worry about. You could just screw those net rails down, but in this case, I wanted to set a good example, so I'm using the proper hardware. And usually when you purchase that hardware, it comes with some 5/8 screws that you can use for attaching the hardware to the top. You don't want that screw going through the top. Now, because this hardware allows those rails to move a little bit, I had to carefully position each rail on the lines that I had made, and I used the legs to get my spacing in the corners just right. The corner blocks I screwed on from the outside with 2-inch wood screws. I knew that I was going to be covering them up later, so didn't worry that they showed on the outside. I worked my way around the table, attaching the rails and using the legs for a spacer as I went, so each leg fits nice and tight. Now, because this table was so big, I used an extra rail down the center, and if there was any bow to any of those rails, I make sure that that bow went up, so I crowned it, but they were pretty straight, just like they were. I used that hold-down hardware on the center rail as well. To attach the legs, first I held them in position and drilled my pilot hole through that block. Then I removed the legs and drilled a hole to accommodate the screw bolts I was using. I screwed in the screw bolts. Then I enlarged the hole in the block and attached the legs with large washers and nuts. You can see I ended up lettering each leg because each one was a little bit different. Now, I made these rails out of poplar, and obviously I don't want that to show, so I cut up some of my veneer, my MDF veneer. It's 1/2 inch. It's thicker than what you'd normally use. I mean, you'd probably want to cover this with solid wood or even a skinny veneer, but I got this, so I cut it up, and I'm going to use this to cover the outside of this rail, make it look nice and pretty like the rest of my beautiful walnut table. It's all legged up, framed up, and ready to flip over. It's starting to look like a table. So it's always exciting when you get to this stage in the project and it's actually starting to look like it's something. It's looking like a dining room table, and that's exciting. Now, I kind of like these sharp corners that are on the top, but my daughter wants them rounded, so we're going to round them because that's what she wants. Now, I made a little template here out of MDF, and I fastened it temporarily to the bottom. I'm going to use that as a guide for my flush cutting bit on the router to make some nice round corners on all of the 4 corners. Need to do that 4 more times so it came out nice and clean. Now along this edge here, obviously we have to do something because it's just the MDF and with a thin veneer on top. So I got this iron-on edge right here. It's walnut. This stuff is heat activated, works great, sticks on there really well. So I'm gonna take my iron and iron that on all the way around the edge. Notice I'm using both my iron and a roller and a sanding block, a soft sanding block, to press that edge banding in place while it cools. And it cools pretty quickly. I'm really taking my time around those corners because they sometimes tend to buckle up on the corners. The banding is somewhat flexible, so if you do it right, it will bend and stick around the corners really well. And it did. So I'm down to the end here where the two of them come together. So I started here and I'm ending up right here. So I got to make this cut so it exactly lines up with that cut right there. I'm going to take my X-Acto knife and I'm going to overlap them and I'm going to cut right through both of them at once. And theoretically, they should match up perfectly. The only difference or the only gap would be the thickness of this knife right here. They do wallpaper this way, so seems like a good idea in this situation. Here we go. This edge banding went on there really nicely. There's a little bit of a extra bit that hangs over the edge, top and bottom, and you have to deal with that somehow. I could trim it off. They do make a little trimmer that I could use, but if I use the trimmer, then it might do some damage to the veneer on the top. So I'm just going to sand through it, and I think that's the safest way. I'm going to use some 150 sandpaper, sand it down so it's even all the way across the top. I really don't want to sand through the veneer on the top of this sheet right here, so I'm going to sand the last little bit of this iron-on edge off by hand. I'm just using some 120 and then some 150 sandpaper to make this edge nice and pretty. Gonna finish this off with my little vibrating sander here and some 150 sandpaper. I'm gonna go nice and easy because I got a really thin veneer. This is Watco oil. As it says on the can, Watco Danish oil finish. Seals and protects. It's the natural version. There are some colors that it comes in. I'm going to use this for finishing this table. This stuff's kind of hard to find some places, especially in places like this in California where we're so careful about things. But the reason is because it is very flammable. It's got a lot of linseed oil in it, and I think that's the flammable part of it. But it's great stuff. I'm going to use it for finishing this table. It seals, or it penetrates and seals, but it's not like a polyurethane or a lacquer. You can continually apply it if it starts to get dull. So I love this stuff. I'm going to use it for finishing my walnut table. All right, I'm just about ready to finish this off, and I'm going to do something here that might seem wrong, but I'm going to do it anyway. I've got a little line right here where I glued on this this edge banding, and you can see the glue just slightly. It's kind of a lighter line, and I need to fix that. So I'm going to use a Sharpie. I know it seems kind of Mickey Mouse, but I'm going to do it because it works. It's almost like staining it. So even though it's not a purist thing to do, I'm going to do it anyway. A brown Sharpie. It works. All right, table's all finished, and here we are sitting around with the fan. You like it, guys?
Love it.
Yeah, it's great. And Luke has a proverb for us.
Yeah, Proverbs 17:6.
Grandchildren are the crown of the elderly, and the glory of children is their parents.
So we got the elderly, the grandchildren, and the parents. Great place to sit around and enjoy our favorite barbecue. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to
Like and subscribe.
Let's pray.
5 fingers here, 5 fingers there. Put them together for a prayer.
Lord, thank you so much.
Amen.